actually I've been very excited to see this film. I've seen a lot of Singaporean films, but for me the film is very different from other Singaporean films. Especially in terms of I think the energy and also the sexual and the racial tension that we see in the film. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. So how did you envision the film, and how did how did it allow you to create a particular image of racial relations, for instance, in Singapore?
Thank you everyone for staying back to watch the film, and I'm very glad that you're here. This film was actually inspired by a question which I've always been confronted by in Singapore is, where are you from? A lot of people, Singaporeans, would ask me whether I take a cab, or when I meet them, they keep asking me whether I'm a foreigner. And it used to, actually I used to be very annoyed initially about the question. Then I understood, if you really look at it, why are they asking me this question? Because although it is a known fact that Indians are part of that Singapore is a multiracial country, yet the minorities are not seen as part of the nation or part of the country. And there's been a huge influx of foreigners, mainly Indians and Bangladeshis, who had come in the 90s as migrant workers. And that has actually changed people's opinion about that Singapore is, mainly a Chinese country, and the minorities are all foreigners. And it was something that I had to live with at that time. And then, there was also a new influx 10 years ago or more of expatriates who came from India and started living amongst the Singaporeans in their condos and in their housing estates. And so, again, people used to think when they say an Indian, he must be from India. So it was a question that I was thinking about, and the whole idea of being a stranger in your own country, that you're not really accepted as a Singaporean. So this is why I started writing the film. Of course, there are many other reasons why I was writing the film. Of course, it was also inspired very much by books I used to read. In fact, this film is not inspired by any film, but more The Stranger by Albert Camus, and Crime and Punishment, and Notes from the Underground. Because there was a connection in these books when I was reading them, because Camus was inspired by Crime and Punishment when he wrote The Stranger, and Notes from the Underground. So I was very intrigued by this whole connection that they had in this series of books, which I liked as well. So many years later, when I was thinking of presenting my first feature film, and I was writing, these are the things that, the whole idea of morality, the whole idea of what is right and wrong, who's to say you're right or who's wrong, religion, sexuality, all these things, especially in a country like Singapore when it's very much repressed. People don't really talk about things like this. They don't talk about racism. It's there, but it's not something that it's not overt. It's sort of simmering under the skin, almost. They don't really come out and confront it. But it's obvious. I've experienced it myself. But most of the time it's projected as a very a country which is in harmony, in racial harmony, which is being a very big emphasis being a multiracial country. So these were the reasons, some of the thoughts of when I was writing the film.
Also, one thing that struck me was the use of imagery, like the case of, you have a lot of use of bars, and I think it's a very creative use of the windows and also the door fence in the public housing units. And so we see the bars, I think, constantly image of the bars constantly recurring throughout the film.
Yeah, it was something that I think a lot of things I written. It was in the subconscious, because I only realized that, of course, in terms of photography, we were looking at spaces like that. But the whole idea of space was something that I was very intrigued by, my personal space. Or someone's emotional, mental, and physical space, and how we constantly negotiate that space with each other every day, with strangers, with your family members, with your lover. This space, and then with foreigners who are, sort of have come into your space. So these were things that, and how it has been robbed, or how you perceived it as being taken away from you. Especially in the situation that you see he is in. He comes out of prison, but it's, Singapore, I'm sure you know the landscape, it's very much like Hong Kong. People live in apartments, very small apartments like that, like the one you see. And so these are things that, of course, that I used in the film to tell the story as a metaphor. And also the idea of crime in this film for me was something that everyone was stealing something from each other. Like the mother robbed him of his space by giving it to a Chinese migrant to live in his room, and she throws him out of the house. And the whole idea of the birds being shot off the tree, its natural habitat, and how the clerk at the social worker's office steals information for love. So, everyone is constantly doing that, and how something has been robbed off the wife, where she's taken out of her own, something is robbed, her happiness is robbed because of the situation she's in, and she feels trapped, and she's turned to religion to kind of find some kind of salvation, instead, out of guilt. So these are all these things that something that sort of restricts you or constricts you into a forced space is what I was looking at. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we can open the floor to questions.
I can hear you. Maybe it's yeah. Anyway, the mic is coming through.
So the people at the back can hear you as well.
All right, thank you for organizing. I have 2 questions. Why did you choose to make a film rather than making a documentary? Because I thought doing a documentary might be more on the ground and real. I don't know if it works. Okay. And I'm particularly interested in the companionship of the Chinese woman and the protagonist. Did you want to emphasize the language barrier between them, or it's just it happens like that, the silence between them, or her talking about her personal life, and do we expect him to actually understand what she's going through? And yeah, this is something I'm particularly interested in.
Sure. Talking about making this into a documentary instead of a film,
yeah.
I am very used to documentaries because that's what I do for a living. I do a lot of documentaries for television, and I've encountered, actually not in Singapore, strangely, I've been around the world making documentaries of people living on the edge, in India, everywhere that I've been, especially social documentaries. In my own country, it's sometimes not, they don't want you to show the reality. It's not spoken of. Everyone is supposed to be happy and contented with their lives. So a lot of people in Singapore, especially a younger generation in the audience, they ask me this question: where did you do your research? Is this Singapore? Did you make this up? I actually was very surprised at these questions, that they are not aware that these places and people exist. It's just that they're not really looking at, about things around them. And in the audience, a foreigner, this expatriate person, she was European, she picked up the mic and she said, I've only been here 3 months and I've seen this. So she was very surprised at the question that these young Singaporeans were asking about their own country. So in a way, I didn't make this up. Every character that you see was inspired by somebody real. The man that, if I can very quickly give you an idea, the protagonist himself is a person I used to meet in the coffee shop. I don't know whether you have that kind of coffee shops here. I think you do. Where he would sit there to wait for a job where they'll pick him up to go to these funerals, and he would sit there the whole day waiting. And sometimes when he gets, he'll come and tell me he's got $10. And he would sit there for so long, and sometimes ask for cigarettes and things like that. That when he gets up, there's always a patch on the wall because of the oil from his head. And he was an Indian man, and he used to go and pick up bodies. When there's for the morgue, he used to do that part-time as well. So I was very interested in what his life was like, and he was always around that coffee shop, like as though he had no home. So these are characters. The woman, this thing in Singapore, it happened about how construction workers were serviced by sex workers in a forest, usually near construction sites. And it was a photograph in the newspapers of how they were all being arrested, being taken out of the forest with the tents behind, was an image that I remember from the newspapers. And the clerk, like there was this bank clerk who stole lots of money for her lover, for love. And she went to jail for the longest time, and the lover got away with it. So what people do, what we don't know about people. So these were some of my inspiration. The mother character, I mean, for me it was a country being silent towards their own people. And of course I drew on my personal story as well, because my mom didn't speak to me for 2 years. So because I did bad things. So anyway, she threw me out of the house. So that came into the film. I mean, she passed on 4 years ago. I wrote this as she had just passed on, so it was in a way in memory of her. And the second question about
companionship.
It was intentional because I didn't want them to really communicate. Anyway, a lot of my films I don't like words.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is taken away when you start creating unnecessary dialogue. And I think they were in similar situation. They were kindred spirits, They both had a daughter to deal with. They both had a life that they were trying to cope and do their best. Actually, he never wanted to commit a crime until the end. He was forced to. But he was trying his best to earn money, to earn some more money than what he would earn outside, so that he could get to the daughter or to his wife. He was trying, but he's not an intellectual. He's someone who is very impulsive, as a person. And she, being a foreigner, and you see, there's something about the language here in Singapore, because he could speak Hokkien in the film, but that's because it's a street language. And his background would allow him to learn Hokkien because he was probably a gangster, the history of where he came from. But if you want to speak Mandarin, you have to be schooled. And so she, coming from China, she would most of them speak Mandarin, of course with a very thick, different accent, depending on where they came from. And a lot of them in the film are real people. They're not actors. So they all had different ways of speaking Mandarin. Like the pimp, the other sex worker, the people in the house, they were all real from China. I wanted authenticity all the way. So of course he was not a pimp, he was just working in Singapore, and she was also working there, and I auditioned them, and some of them just came and did it for me. So the language, as you said, I think the emotions would have connected them more than words. So that's why I intentionally didn't want, in fact the actors were told not to speak to each other. I kept them very aloof and not to interact and be too friendly with each other. So the whole idea for me of her having sex with him, for me, I wanted it to be a bit magical in that way. Although it was not love, it was maybe she was giving him something in return. It was not, and it wasn't lust either, So it had, I didn't want it to be a love story. Yeah.
So any other questions?
I'll just.
Yes. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it seems like you've taken your characters into very, very dark places, or they basically live there. But so, like when you construct your script or your story, you have to take the deep dive into the dark places. So aside from what you have just made reference to the books, what other sources that enables you that have to have written something so dark?
Okay, I'll tell you the lighter side of my life. I wouldn't want to go into the darker side, into that abyss. It will be too dark. I'm very twisted. No, but I'll tell you, I mean, that the title of the film, The Yellow Bird, came out of my childhood. It is actually because my mother used to say, if you see a yellow bird, make a wish. You'll meet someone nice or you'll hear good news. So this is something that I worked on as I was writing. And I have been to places that I was not supposed to be. I had a very difficult, I think, issues growing up, being Indian, although I think it's very superficial now, thinking back, I was discriminated in school for being Indian. I always thought I wanted to be Chinese. All my life. I took Mandarin in school, so I did not want to study my language. Of course, I felt very ashamed of